Good morning, everyone. Good morning, class. How are you? So, this morning, let's start this wonderful day of learning. For today's meeting, we will explore the construction of program learning outcomes, course learning outcomes, and intended learning outcomes. I would like to introduce to you the members of Group 1. We have Jenaline Abad, Lucelle Tumanda, and Grace Kasing. For a short introduction, how is learning outcome defined? Do you have any idea based on the previous lessons learned? How is learning outcome defined? Learning outcome describes the measurable skills, abilities, and knowledge or values that students should be able to demonstrate as a result of completing a course. In short, it describes what the student will do. So these are the goals. First, explain the construction of program learning outcomes. Second, explain the construction of course learning outcomes. And third, explain the construction of intended learning outcomes. For a short recap, we will define the outcome-based education. The emphasis is placed on the clearly articulated idea of what students are expected to know and be able to do, and what skills and knowledge they need to have when they leave the school system. Let's go back to our topic. First, we will discuss the program learning outcomes presented by Jenaline Abad.
Hello class, so I'll be discussing about program learning outcomes or often called as PLOs. So for the information of everyone, PLOs are statements that specify what students will know or be able to do as a result of an activity and are expressed as knowledge, skills, attitudes, or values. That means PLOs describes what students should be able to do as a result of a successful completion of their program or general education courses required for their program. So to further understand about PLOs, it is measurable expectations or anticipated outcomes and a comprehensive and well-developed list that can provide information about student learning, curriculum, and teaching. So for this, the learning outcomes must have a concise descriptions of the impact of the program that will have on its students. Another thing is assessing or measuring learning outcomes can inform the institution about the educational environment. So above all, PLO should make sense for your particular academic program. They can refer to distinct areas of knowledge within your field. Example, algorithms, or to broader abilities like analytical thinking, problem solving. But the key here is to paint a clear picture of the specific skills for students will be graduating with. Okay? So, moving on in writing PLOs. It is essential to learning-centered institutions because student achievement of program learning outcomes is assessed on an ongoing basis through alignment with an assessment of course learning outcomes. So the results are used as evidence of student learning and as data on where programs can be adjusted for improvement in student learning. Okay. So, writing PLOs by clearly stating the outcome that occurs as a result of the education, institutions, and programs become a better position for using effective techniques and pedagogies for advancing student learning. So, on this, they are able to ask what tools, instruments, or devices, theories, and concepts or types of techniques would students be able to apply to their career field upon completion of the program. Then, they should be observable and with appropriate measurable. Each set of outcomes should be comprehensive, coherent, and contextualized for a specific discipline. So this means it must be an iterative process of evaluating the extent to which students have developed certain key skills through coursework and learning activities within the program curriculum. PLOs should be clearly written and easily understood by faculty, students, staff, administrators, and external constituencies. So, a well formulated set of program learning outcomes, or PLOs, will describe what a faculty hopes to accomplish successfully in offering their particular degree to prospective students, or what specific skills, competencies, and knowledge the faculty believes that graduates of the program will have attained by degree completion. Okay, so let's moving on. In writing PLOs, the use of action verbs from Bloom's taxonomy helps to ensure that a student learning outcome is measurable. So try to recall the Bloom's taxonomy in previous lesson we had in assessment in learning 1 and 2. So as we remember, Bloom's taxonomy is a hierarchical design of ways of thinking, action, or performance verbs that classifies learning or cognition into 6 levels categorized from less to more complex. So those levels are remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. So I have here pyramid that shows the levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So as we observe from the pyramid, the lowest form or the level 1 there is remember. So it typically used to recall facts and basic concepts in learning. Sample verbs to use like define, describe, duplicate, find, identify, and many others. So the level 2 is, or the second was understand, typically used to explain ideas or concepts. Sample verbs like classify, describe, discuss, explain, estimate, and many others. Level 3 was apply, typically use information in a new way or situations. Sample verbs like apply, carry out, choose, demonstrate, dramatize, employ, or many others. And level 4, the fourth one was analyze, typically used to draw connections among ideas. Sample verbs to use like attribute, compare, contrast, criticize, deconstruct, differentiate, discriminate, distinguish, examine, and many others. And level 5 was to evaluate, typically used to produce judgment or justify a stand or decision. Sample verbs like appraise, argue, check, conclude, critique, defend, evaluate, and many more. And the last one, which was the complex, was to create. Typically used to produce new or original work. Sample verbs like assemble, construct, create, design, develop, or formulate. Sample formulate a problem. So that was the 6 levels of Bloom's taxonomy that helps the program learning outcomes be measurable. Okay, so I have here example of program learning outcomes. So BS Ed major in Mathematics Program Learning Outcomes in Principles and Strategies in Teaching Mathematics by Mrs. Annalyn D. Pisidas. So the program learning outcomes here in the subject Principles and Strategies Teaching Mathematics exhibit competence in mathematical concepts and procedures, exhibit proficiency in relating mathematics to other curricular areas, manifest meaningful and comprehensive pedagogical content knowledge of mathematics, demonstrate competence in designing, constructing, and utilizing different forms of assessment in mathematics, demonstrate proficiency in problem solving by solving and creating routine and non-routine problems with different levels of complexity, use effectively appropriate approaches, methods, and techniques in teaching mathematics, including technological tools, and appreciate mathematics as an opportunity for creative work, moments of enlightenment, discovery, and gaining insights of the world. So that was all about PLO's program learning outcomes, and I hope you understand well.
So let's proceed to our next topic. We have the course learning outcomes.
Good day everyone. Today I will be discussing about course learning outcomes or CLOs. Course learning outcomes or CLOs is central to your course curriculum. It means that these course learning outcomes must be aligned with the course curriculum. They articulate to students, faculty, and other stakeholders what students will achieve in each course and how their learning will be measured. Course learning outcomes or CLOs will explain to everyone what students will learn and how their learning will be evaluated. Learning outcome is a measurable, observable, and specific statement that clearly indicates what a student should know and be able to do as a result of learning. Well-written learning outcomes involve the following parts. First, action verb. Action verb describes an observable action or a description of what the learner will be able to do and under which conditions they will able to do it, and the performance level they should be able to reach. Second is a subject content. Students' learning achievements in understanding and applying the course content as observed through scores on exams, paper assignments, and discussion. Third, level of achievement, and lastly, condition of performance if applicable. A condition of performance identifies if students are only performing this outcome in a specific context. This tells students that they will be performing this task, but that they will be supervised while they do so. Again, you don't need a condition of performance for every course learning outcomes. Only include a condition of performance if that information clarifies the specific outcomes students will achieve in the course. And now let's proceed to the important steps in constructing course learning outcomes for your course and things to consider. Step 1. Select an action verb using Bloom's taxonomy. As we can see, these are the action verb we must select in generating learning outcomes using Bloom's taxonomy. From lower order to higher order, we have recall, examine, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. The action verb under recall are describe, name, find, list, relate, and write. The action verb under examine are explain, compare, discuss, predict, outline, and restate. Under the apply are complete, use, examine, illustrate, classify, and solve. The action verb that can be used in analyzing are compare and contrast, examine, explain, identify, categorize, and investigate. Next is evaluate. We have justify, assess, prioritize, recommend, rate, and inspect. Lastly, create. We have plan, invent, compose, design, construction, and synthesize. Many verbs can't be directly observed and therefore are difficult to assess in the classroom. Do not use the following verbs like understand, know, comprehend, appreciate, be familiar with, study, be aware, become acquainted with, gain knowledge of, cover, learn, and realize. Let's proceed to step 2. Select the subject content students are performing the task for. It is important that we select the appropriate subject content because it communicates ideas and imparts knowledge. It needs to be authentic and contribute basic ideas, principles, and concepts. And now let's proceed to the last steps. Decide if your course learning outcomes requires either a level of achievement or a condition of performance. A level of achievement identifies how proficient students need to be in a task. For example, in a composition course, you might say, recognize the mathematical concepts in nature, science, and real life. This tells students the level of achievement that's expected of them. So it will determine how expert students should be in the activities, and it will explain what is expected from the students. So here are some tips and tricks in constructing course learning outcomes. Course learning outcomes should be SMART outcomes. SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. SMART should be the guide to create effective course learning outcomes. And in achieving SMART course learning outcomes, we must remember these guide questions. So let's start with specific. Learning outcomes inform students of the standards by which they will be assessed, and it must be clear and precise. So here are some guide questions. Is there a description of a precise behavior and the situation it will be performed in? Is it concrete, detailed, focused, and defined? Next is measurable. Learning outcomes must indicate how learning will be assessed. Can the performance of the objective be observed and measured? Achievable. Attainable and not impossible to achieve. With a reasonable amount of effort and application, can the objective be achieved? Are you attempting too much? Next is relevant. All learners who complete the activity or course satisfactorily should be able to demonstrate the knowledge or skills addressed in the outcome. Some guide questions are: is the objective important or worthwhile to the learner or stakeholder? Is it possible to achieve this objective? And lastly, time-bound. Learning outcomes must be feasible. The deadline by which the knowledge or skills should be acquired must be set in the learning outcome. Here are some guide questions. Is there a time limit, rate number, percentage, or frequency clearly stated? And when will this objective be accomplished? So here are some examples of course learning outcomes. Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in Mathematics, course learning outcomes in Principles and Strategies in Teaching Mathematics by Mrs. Analindi Pisidas. Develop learning activities including instructional materials, applying the principles and strategies in teaching mathematics. Perform teaching demonstration, applying the principles and strategies in teaching mathematics. So that was the example of course learning outcomes by Mrs. Analindi Pisidas. So I think that will be all for my topic, course learning outcomes, and I hope you've learned something.
We are now at the last topic, the intended learning outcomes, presented by Grace Casing.
What is intended learning outcomes? Intended learning outcomes, or ILOS, is a student-centered and describe your intention for your students' learning in the module. They specify what students should know and be able to do by the end of the module. As a rule of thumb, it is unlikely that there will be more than 8 to 10 ILOS per module. Learning outcomes are prefaced by and completion of the module, students will be able to and are followed by the verb. The verbs used for intended learning outcomes need to be specific because outcomes need to be measurable and appropriate to the level of the module. There are many lists of appropriate verbs available, primarily based on Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy of learning objectives in 1956, which identified 6 levels of the cognitive domain discussed by Jeneline Abad and Lucille Tumanda. So the first one is remember. Second, understand. Third, apply. Fourth, analyze. Five, evaluate. And six is the create. Try to avoid expressions such as know, understand, appreciate, and be familiar with, and be aware that these are too vague to convey the exact nature of the outcome being sought on are difficult to access accurately. Steps to writing intended learning outcomes. It can be helpful to consider using the following 5-step process in designing intended learning outcomes. So the first one, decide on the purpose. Why is this unit being offered? What do students need to learn in this unit to progress through the course and achieve the course learning outcomes? Like this question, where does the students learn in this unit fit within the whole course structure? If one of your students was asked what they learned in your unit, what would you like the students say? What specific intellectual and practical skills will the student leave the unit with that they lacked when they started? What will every student who passes this unit understand and be able to do? These are the following questions that you have to consider to identify your purpose. Second step, identify the content. It is recommended that you start by defining the content that the student will learn within the unit and which is defined within the purposes previously identified. When more than one of the identified purposes contains the same content, it is appropriate that to merge this into a single intended outcome. So the third step, select the appropriate verb. Once the content has been defined, consider the level of cognitive activity with which the student will be expected to engage. That is, what level of thinking do you want students to be used with the content? Either knowledge, either understanding. You can choose the 6 level of domain. In an intended learning outcome, the level of cognitive engagement can be expressed with the verb. These identify what the student is expected to do with the content. Since Jeneline Abad and Lucille Tumanda discussed the previous topic, I will no longer dig deeper into the taxonomy of learning outcomes. We discussed these topics in Assessment and Learning 1, Chapter 3, with the title Appropriateness and Alignment of Assessment Methods to Learning Outcomes. So step 4, add the context when necessary. When you have identified what the students will learn and what they will do with it, the next step is to define the context in which student will be able to do the verb with the context. Again, will be able to do the verb with the context. When selecting the appropriate context, it is crucial to consider the place the unit occupies within the course structure and its contribution to student development towards course learning outcome, just as when selecting verbs. Context helps to define and put limits around what you're going to teach the students within the unit. Identifying a context is most important at Bloom's revised level of applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. But it is when necessary to specify the content to be specific about what you measure. Last but not the least, step number 5, ensure clarity. To ensure that intended learning outcome is well written, the final step is to put the three elements together and ensure that the whole makes sense, not to you as an expert, but to your students who are learners in the area. You will need to remove any jargon or discipline specific language and replace them with plain language. For second and third units, however, it would be appropriate to use language that students are familiar with from previous compulsory units in the course. So when you're analyzing your intended learning outcomes, for clarity, ask yourself, if English was my second language, would I be able to grasp the meaning of the learning outcome expected? Have I avoided unnecessarily complex language and unexplained terminology? Those are the steps that you need to consider in writing intended learning outcomes.
These are the examples of intended learning outcomes. So, for example, this is the purpose. Students will learn about anatomy and basic functions. They will learn about clinical scenarios and how to get the information needed to identify abnormalities. So the content here is about anatomy, basic functions, and clinical scenarios. This purpose in this example is for a first year student, typically offered in the second semester, with the first semester unit as a prerequisite and serving this example as a prerequisite for multiple second year units. The type of knowledge required is functioning, in which the student works or operates in the proper or particular way. So we could use the verbs apply, dramatize, interpret, solve a problem, and assess. So for this example, for further clarity, it is needed to identify for students how, where, when, and in what circumstances or situations they will be expected to deploy the chosen verb. Depending on the verb that is chosen, appropriate contextual information might include. So the context here is the identification of abnormalities or clinical scenarios. So to ensure the clarity, we will combine the three elements since you already figured it out. So I have here an example, the combination of three elements. On the completion of this module, student will be able to use the verb apply their learnings in anatomy and basic functions to get the information needed to identify abnormalities in clinical scenarios. So I have also here the the verb dramatize. Students will be able to dramatize clinical scenarios and get the information needed to identify abnormalities based on their learning about anatomy and basic functions. So, this is the example of the intended learning outcomes. I have here another example based on the subject Principles and Strategies in Teaching Mathematics by Mrs. Annalyn Pisadas. At the end of the lesson, the student should be able to develop learning activities including instructional materials, applying the principles and strategies in teaching mathematics. Do Group 1 presenters help you understand the construction of program learning outcomes, course learning outcomes, and intended learning outcomes? So here's the final wave of this lesson. Intended learning outcomes. It is the specific learning outcomes in the course learning outcomes. It intends on what the student achieve in individual lessons or unit of a particular subject. So for course learning outcomes, the stirring together of dry ingredients, cocoa, baking powder, baking soda, flour, salt, and sugar represents a one course learning outcome. Combining wet ingredients, eggs, butter, oil, vanilla extract, and water represents second course learning outcome. And combining chocolate cream cheese frosting ingredients represent a third course learning outcome. Making a cake is an incremental process done in steps, just as course learning outcomes are incremental gains in knowledge and skills that students develop during the program. The program learning outcomes, the final product, the cake, represents a program learning outcome. The integrated ingredients and how the ingredients were prepared to contribute to the outcome, which is greater than the sum of the individual parts. Again, do Group 1 presenters help you understand the construction of program learning outcomes, course learning outcomes, and intended learning outcomes? If yes, thank you for participating and listening. I hope you're happy and enjoying today. God bless everyone.